Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of what would soon become one of Africa's most ambitious waterways. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site, where thousands of workers had been laboring for months to create an artificial river system that would stretch across hundreds of miles of Burkina Faso's landscape. But today, something extraordinary was about to happen that would change everything the world thought they knew about this young leader's vision. The 35-year-old military officer had risen to power through a series of events that surprised even his closest allies. Born in a small village where water was scarce and wildlife had long disappeared due to drought and human encroachment, Traoré had witnessed firsthand how environmental destruction could devastate entire communities. His childhood memories were filled with stories his grandmother told about rivers that once flowed freely and forests that teemed with life. As he surveyed the massive construction project before him, Traoré's mind wandered back to a conversation he had with an elderly wildlife conservationist 3 months earlier. Dr. Aminata Kone had approached him with a proposal so unusual that most government officials would have dismissed it immediately. She had spent decades studying the migration patterns of West African animals and had discovered something remarkable about the region where the artificial river was being built. The proposed waterway wasn't just any ordinary irrigation project. Engineers had designed it to mimic the natural flow patterns of ancient rivers that had dried up over centuries of climate change and human activity. What Dr. Kone had realized through years of research and satellite imagery analysis was that this artificial river could serve as a corridor for wildlife migration that had been disrupted for generations. Traoré had initially focused on the river's practical benefits for agriculture and human settlements. The waterway would provide irrigation for crops, drinking water for communities, and support for small-scale fishing operations. These were the selling points he had used to convince international donors and his own government to fund the massive undertaking. But Dr. Kone's research had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never considered. The conservationist had shown him detailed maps indicating how various animal species had historically moved through this exact region during different seasons. Elephants, antelopes, zebras, and countless bird species had once followed migration routes that connected different ecosystems across West Africa. The construction of roads, expansion of agriculture, and climate-induced changes had gradually severed these natural highways, trapping animal populations in increasingly smaller habitats. What made Traoré's artificial river project unique was its potential to restore these ancient migration corridors. Unlike natural rivers that might change course over time, this engineered waterway could be designed with specific features to support wildlife movement. The banks could include vegetation that animals preferred for food and shelter. The width and depth could accommodate different species' crossing needs. Strategic placement of islands and shallow areas could provide resting spots for migrating birds. Dr. Kone had presented compelling evidence that reintroducing animals along this corridor could have cascading positive effects on the entire ecosystem. Plants would spread through seed dispersal by animals. Soil quality would improve through natural fertilization. The artificial river itself would benefit from the natural processes that animals contribute to aquatic ecosystems. But the most intriguing aspect of her proposal was the scale she envisioned. Rather than a small pilot program with a few dozen animals, Dr. Kone suggested releasing millions of creatures along the river corridor. This wasn't about creating a zoo or a contained wildlife preserve. It was about restoring a functional ecosystem that could support itself and gradually expand beyond the immediate river area. The logistics alone seemed overwhelming. Where would millions of animals come from? How would they be transported safely? What about the risks to human communities along the river? How could they ensure the animals would actually use the corridor as intended rather than dispersing randomly across the landscape? These questions had kept Traoré awake for weeks as he wrestled with the decision. His advisors were divided. Some saw the wildlife component as an unnecessary complication that could jeopardize the entire river project. Others recognized the potential for international acclaim and tourism revenue that could result from such an ambitious conservation effort. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Kone introduced him to a network of wildlife reserves and conservation organizations across Africa that were facing their own challenges. Many facilities were overcrowded with animals that had been rescued from poaching, habitat loss, or human-wildlife conflicts. These organizations were eager to find suitable release sites where animals could return to natural behaviors and contribute to ecosystem restoration. International partnerships began to emerge. Wildlife reserves in Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, and other countries offered to contribute animals to the project. Research institutions provided expertise in animal transport and acclimatization. Environmental organizations pledged funding and logistical support. As Traoré stood watching the final preparations for the river's completion, he knew that tomorrow would mark the beginning of something unprecedented in modern conservation history. Trucks loaded with specially designed transport containers were already beginning to arrive at staging areas along the river corridor. Veterinarians, wildlife experts, and local community leaders had been preparing for months. The young leader understood that this project would define his legacy far beyond any military or political achievements. He was about to attempt something that had never been tried at this scale: the intentional restoration of a wildlife migration corridor using an artificial waterway as the foundation for ecosystem recovery. The first convoy of animals arrived at dawn, just as the artificial river began flowing at full capacity for the first time. Dr. Kone had insisted on this timing, explaining that many species were most active during early morning hours and would be more likely to explore their new environment when stress levels were naturally lower. Traoré watched from a specially constructed observation platform as the initial release began. The operation had been planned with military precision, but the reality of seeing thousands of animals emerging from transport containers along the riverbank was both chaotic and magnificent. The first group consisted of various antelope species that had been selected for their adaptability and important role in establishing grazing patterns that other animals would later follow. What surprised everyone, including the wildlife experts, was how quickly the animals seemed to understand their new environment. Within hours of release, herds were already moving along the river corridor in patterns that roughly matched the ancient migration routes Dr. Kone had identified in her research. It was as if some genetic memory was guiding them toward behaviors their ancestors had followed for thousands of years. Local communities that lived near the river had been involved in planning from the beginning, but seeing the reality of millions of animals moving through their region was still overwhelming. Village elder Amadou Ouedraogo had been skeptical when Traoré first explained the project to community leaders. His village had struggled with human-wildlife conflict in the past when smaller numbers of animals had wandered into crop fields. However, the artificial river had been designed with these concerns in mind. Buffer zones of native vegetation provided food sources that kept most animals away from agricultural areas. Strategic placement of the river channels directed animal movement away from villages, while still allowing communities to access water for their own needs. The economic benefits became apparent almost immediately. International media attention brought journalists, researchers, and tourists to the region in unprecedented numbers. Local guides who had been trained during the preparation phase found themselves in high demand. Women's cooperatives that had learned to prepare traditional meals for visitors suddenly had more business than they could handle. But the most remarkable development was the speed at which the ecosystem began changing. Dr. Kone had predicted that it would take years to see significant environmental improvements, but changes were visible within weeks. The constant movement of animals was aerating soil along the riverbank and distributing seeds across the landscape. Bird populations increased dramatically as insects and small animals thrived in the newly enriched environment. Traoré made daily visits to different sections of the river corridor, documenting the progress and addressing challenges as they arose. The logistical complexity of managing millions of animals across hundreds of miles required constant adaptation of their original plans. Mobile veterinary units moved along the corridor, monitoring animal health and treating injuries or illnesses. One of the most unexpected challenges came from the animals themselves. Different species that had been separated in captivity or in isolated reserves were encountering each other for the first time in generations. Some interactions were positive, with species forming beneficial relationships that supported each other's survival. Others required intervention from wildlife experts to prevent conflicts. The elephant herds presented particular challenges and opportunities. These intelligent animals seemed to grasp the purpose of the river corridor more quickly than other species. They began creating their own trails that connected water access points with feeding areas, essentially engineering improvements to the habitat that benefited other animals as well. International observers started arriving to study what was being called the Burkina Faso experiment. Conservationists from around the world wanted to understand how such a massive animal release could be successful when smaller reintroduction efforts often struggled. The key seemed to be the combination of appropriate habitat design, community involvement, and the sheer scale that allowed natural ecosystem processes to reassert themselves. Dr. Kone spent her days moving between research stations that had been established along the river, collecting data on animal behavior, population dynamics, and environmental changes. Her preliminary findings were so promising that several international journals had already requested research papers, even though the project was only weeks old. The success was not without critics. Some international conservation organizations questioned whether removing animals from established reserves to create this experimental ecosystem was ethically justified. Others worried about the long-term sustainability of maintaining such a large artificial river system in a region prone to drought. Traoré addressed these concerns in interviews with international media, explaining that the project was designed to be self-sustaining once the ecosystem became established. The artificial river was fed by a combination of sources including underground aquifers, rainwater collection, and recycled water from agricultural and municipal systems. More importantly, the economic benefits were already generating revenue that could support long-term maintenance. Tourism was bringing foreign currency into local communities. Agricultural productivity was increasing due to improved soil conditions and water availability. The government was receiving international grants and partnerships that more than offset the initial investment. As the second month of the project began, patterns were emerging that exceeded even Dr. Kone's optimistic projections. Animals were not only surviving in their new environment, but reproducing at rates that suggested the ecosystem was providing better conditions than many of the reserves they had come from. The artificial river had become a laboratory for understanding how large-scale ecosystem restoration could work in practice. Universities from around the world were sending research teams to study different aspects of the project. The data being collected would influence conservation strategies across Africa and beyond. Traoré realized that what had begun as an infrastructure project to provide water for human communities had evolved into something much more significant. He was witnessing the birth of a new model for balancing human development with environmental restoration, and the world was watching to see if this ambitious experiment could be replicated elsewhere. 3 months after the initial release, the artificial river ecosystem had developed its own rhythm that amazed even the most experienced wildlife biologists. The millions of animals were no longer just surviving in their new environment. They were transforming it in ways that created a cascading series of positive changes throughout the region. Dr. Kone had established a network of camera traps and sensor stations along the entire corridor to monitor animal movements and behavior patterns. The data revealed something extraordinary. The animals were essentially redesigning their habitat to optimize it for multiple species simultaneously. Elephants were creating water access points that smaller animals could use. Bird species were distributing seeds that created feeding areas for herbivores. Predator populations were establishing territories that maintained natural balance without overwhelming prey species. The economic transformation of surrounding communities was equally dramatic. Fatimata Sawadogo, a single mother from a village near the river's midpoint, had been struggling to support her 3 children through small-scale farming before the project began. Now she was running a successful eco-lodge that hosted researchers and tourists from around the world. Her traditional knowledge about local plants and animals had become valuable expertise that visitors were eager to learn about. Similar success stories were emerging throughout the region. Young men who had been considering migration to urban areas for employment were finding opportunities as guides, wildlife monitors, and entrepreneurs serving the growing ecotourism industry. Women's cooperatives were expanding their activities to include handicraft production, traditional medicine preparation, and cultural demonstrations for visitors. Traoré had been invited to present the project's results at international conferences, but he preferred to spend his time along the river corridor, observing the changes firsthand and addressing challenges as they arose. The success had brought new responsibilities and unexpected complications that required constant attention. One significant challenge emerged from the project's very success. The artificial river was attracting animals from far beyond the planned release areas. Wild populations from neighboring countries were beginning to migrate toward the corridor, drawn by the abundance of water, food, and suitable habitat. While this was positive for regional conservation, it created diplomatic complications with neighboring governments and strained the carrying capacity of certain sections. International media coverage had made Traoré a global celebrity, with documentaries, news features, and social media content spreading the story worldwide. However, he remained focused on the practical aspects of managing what had become the largest successful wildlife reintroduction in modern history. The project's impact on climate patterns was beginning to become measurable. The increased vegetation along the river corridor was affecting local weather patterns with more frequent rainfall and moderated temperatures. Agricultural yields in the surrounding area were increasing, not just due to improved water availability, but also because of better soil conditions created by animal activity and natural fertilization. Dr. Kone's research team was documenting changes in plant communities that were happening much faster than anyone had predicted. Species that had been absent from the region for decades were returning, carried as seeds by migrating animals or birds. The artificial river was becoming a natural highway for biodiversity recovery that extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Universities and research institutions were establishing permanent field stations along the corridor. Students and scientists from dozens of countries were conducting studies on everything from soil microbiology to large mammal behavior. The river had become an outdoor laboratory that was generating new insights into ecosystem restoration and conservation biology. The success was also creating political pressure for Traoré to expand the project. Other regions within Burkina Faso were requesting similar initiatives. Neighboring countries were expressing interest in connecting their own conservation areas to the river corridor. International environmental organizations were offering funding for expansion projects. However, Traoré was cautious about rapid expansion. The current project's success depended on careful planning, community involvement, and constant monitoring and adjustment. Scaling up too quickly could jeopardize the gains that had been achieved and potentially create new problems that might undermine the entire initiative. The artificial river had also become a source of national pride for Burkina Faso. Citizens, who had initially been skeptical about the young leader's ambitious project, were now celebrating it as evidence of their country's capacity for innovation and environmental leadership. International respect for the nation had increased significantly, leading to new diplomatic and economic opportunities. Wildlife populations were not just surviving but thriving in ways that surprised conservation experts. Breeding rates were higher than in many established reserves, suggesting that the artificial river environment was providing optimal conditions for reproductive success. Genetic diversity was increasing as previously isolated populations mixed and interbred. The predator-prey balance was establishing itself naturally without the intensive management that many wildlife reserves required. Large carnivores were maintaining their populations at sustainable levels while keeping herbivore numbers in check. This natural regulation was one of the strongest indicators that the ecosystem was functioning as a self-sustaining system. Community leaders from the region were being invited to share their experiences with other conservation projects around the world. Their insights into how local knowledge and traditional practices had been integrated with modern conservation science were influencing approaches to community-based conservation internationally. As Traoré walked along the riverbank in the evening, watching elephants drink while birds filled the air above them, he reflected on how much had changed since the project began. What had started as a practical solution to water scarcity had become a model for how human development and environmental restoration could work together to create benefits for both people and wildlife. The young leader knew that the true test of the project's success would come in the years ahead, as the ecosystem continued to evolve and mature. but the early results suggested that they had achieved something remarkable, proof that it was possible to reverse environmental degradation on a massive scale while improving human livelihoods at the same time. By the 6th month, the artificial river project had attracted the attention of world leaders and international organizations in ways that Traoré had never anticipated. The United Nations Environment Program had designated the corridor as a flagship example of successful large-scale ecosystem restoration. Delegations from dozens of countries were requesting visits to study the project's methods and results. The scale of international interest created new opportunities and challenges. Foreign governments were offering partnership agreements and funding for expansion projects. Private investors were proposing ecotourism developments and sustainable agriculture initiatives. Research institutions wanted to establish permanent facilities along the river corridor. Dr. Kone had been documenting changes that went far beyond what anyone had expected when the project began. The millions of released animals had triggered a chain reaction of ecological recovery that was spreading throughout the region. Plant communities were being restored by seed dispersal. Soil chemistry was improving through natural fertilization processes. Even groundwater levels were being affected by the changed vegetation patterns. Local communities had adapted to their new reality with remarkable creativity and entrepreneurship. Traditional skills that had been declining in importance were suddenly valuable again. Elders who possessed knowledge about traditional animal tracking, plant identification, and seasonal patterns found themselves in demand as consultants for research projects and tourism operations. The village school nearest to the river had been transformed into a center of excellence for environmental education. Children from the community were learning alongside young researchers from international universities. The traditional boundary between academic knowledge and local wisdom was dissolving as both proved essential for understanding and managing the ecosystem. Traoré had established a governance structure that balanced scientific management with community participation and traditional knowledge. Local chiefs worked alongside wildlife biologists and government officials to make decisions about the river corridor's development. This collaborative approach was being studied as a model for community-based conservation in other parts of Africa. The economic impact was becoming significant at both local and national levels. Tourism revenue was flowing into communities that had previously had limited cash income. Young people who had been planning to migrate to cities were finding opportunities in their home region. The project was creating a new model of rural development that combined conservation with economic opportunity. International certification programs were being developed to ensure that the ecotourism and agricultural activities associated with the river maintained high environmental and social standards. Fair trade partnerships were being established for products ranging from traditional crafts to sustainably harvested plant materials. The artificial river's success had also created unexpected diplomatic benefits for Burkina Faso. The country was being recognized as a leader in innovative conservation approaches. International cooperation agreements were being signed with countries around the world. Development aid was increasing as donors recognized the government's capacity for successful project implementation. Wildlife populations were exceeding all projections for healthy ecosystem development. The carrying capacity of the river corridor appeared to be much higher than initial estimates had suggested. This was partly due to the animals' own activities in improving habitat quality, and partly due to the artificial river's design, which provided more reliable water and food sources than natural systems. Genetic studies were revealing that the mixing of previously isolated animal populations was creating healthier, more diverse gene pools. This genetic recovery was particularly important for species that had suffered from inbreeding in small, isolated reserves. The river corridor was functioning as a genetic highway that was improving the long-term viability of wildlife populations throughout the region. Climate monitoring stations were documenting measurable changes in local weather patterns. The restored vegetation was moderating temperatures, increasing humidity, and affecting precipitation patterns. These microclimate changes were extending the benefits of the project beyond the immediate river corridor into surrounding agricultural areas. The success had also attracted critics and challenges. Some international conservation organizations questioned whether the massive animal relocations had disrupted ecosystems in the source areas where animals had been removed. Others worried about the long-term sustainability of maintaining such an extensive artificial water system in a climate-changing world. Traoré addressed these concerns by commissioning independent assessments of the project's environmental and social impacts. The results were overwhelmingly positive, but he insisted on continued monitoring and adaptation based on new evidence and changing conditions. The project was generating scientific discoveries that were influencing conservation theory and practice worldwide. Research papers were being published on topics ranging from animal behavior in restored habitats to the economics of community-based conservation. The river corridor had become a living laboratory that was advancing understanding of ecosystem restoration at unprecedented scales. Technology was playing an increasingly important role in managing the complex ecosystem. Satellite monitoring systems tracked animal movements and vegetation changes. Automated sensor networks monitored water quality and weather conditions. Mobile applications allowed community members to report wildlife sightings and environmental observations. Educational institutions from around the world were developing partnerships with local schools and community organizations. Student exchange programs were bringing young people from different countries to learn about conservation and sustainable development. These educational connections were creating lasting relationships that would support continued international cooperation. As the first year of the project approached, Traoré was beginning to plan for long-term sustainability and expansion. The success of the initial river corridor had demonstrated that large-scale ecosystem restoration was possible, but maintaining and replicating these results would require continued innovation and adaptation. The young leader understood that the project's ultimate success would be measured not just by its immediate environmental and economic benefits, but by its influence on conservation approaches worldwide and its contribution to demonstrating that human development and environmental protection could work together to create a better future for both people and wildlife. 1 year after the first animals were released into the artificial river corridor, the project had evolved far beyond anyone's original vision. The ecosystem had become self-regulating in ways that surprised even Dr. Kone, who had spent decades studying wildlife ecology. The millions of animals were no longer just inhabitants of the restored habitat. They had become its active architects, continuously improving and expanding the environment through their natural behaviors. The river corridor had grown from its original boundaries through natural processes. Animals were creating new pathways that connected to water sources and feeding areas beyond the planned limits. Seeds dispersed by migrating birds and mammals were establishing vegetation corridors that extended the restored ecosystem into areas that had been degraded for decades. Traoré had been invited to address the United Nations General Assembly about the project's success, but he chose instead to host an international conference along the river itself. Representatives from 50 countries gathered at temporary facilities, constructed by local communities to see the results firsthand and learn about replicating the approach in other regions. The economic transformation of the region had exceeded all projections. Rural communities that had been among the poorest in West Africa were now experiencing prosperity that was attracting attention from development economists worldwide. The key to success had been ensuring that benefits were distributed equitably throughout the communities, rather than concentrated among a few individuals or families. Local banks had been established to help community members invest their new income in education, healthcare, and business development. Microfinance programs were supporting small-scale enterprises that served the growing ecotourism industry while maintaining traditional cultural practices. The project had demonstrated that conservation and poverty reduction could be achieved simultaneously. Wildlife researchers were documenting behaviors that had never been observed before in captive or semi-captive populations. Animals that had been raised in reserves or rehabilitation centers were exhibiting complex social behaviors and migration patterns that appeared to be genetic memories activated by the appropriate environmental conditions. The artificial river was revealing new insights into animal cognition and adaptation. The success had also created unexpected challenges related to the project's visibility and popularity. Tourist demand was overwhelming the infrastructure that local communities could provide sustainably. International media attention was attracting visitors who were not always prepared for responsible wildlife viewing. Traoré had to implement visitor management systems to protect both the animals and the local communities. Dr. Kone's research team had expanded into a multinational consortium of scientists studying every aspect of the restored ecosystem. Their findings were influencing conservation policies and practices around the world. Universities were establishing field programs that allowed students to study in the river corridor as part of their degree requirements. The project's influence on regional politics had been profound. Neighboring countries were requesting technical assistance to develop similar initiatives. Regional cooperation agreements were being negotiated to create connected conservation corridors that would span multiple national boundaries. The artificial river was becoming the foundation for a continental approach to wildlife conservation. Traditional ecological knowledge from local communities was being formally documented and integrated with scientific research. Elders who had preserved oral histories about historical animal migrations and environmental conditions were working with researchers to understand how the restored ecosystem compared to pre-colonial conditions. This collaboration was producing insights that neither scientific research nor traditional knowledge could have achieved independently. The corridor's impact on climate regulation was becoming measurable at a regional scale. Satellite imagery showed changes in vegetation cover extending hundreds of miles beyond the river itself. Weather stations were recording increased precipitation and moderated temperatures throughout the surrounding area. The project was demonstrating how ecosystem restoration could contribute to climate change adaptation. International funding organizations were redesigning their conservation programs based on lessons learned from the river corridor. The success had proven that large-scale landscape-level conservation could be more effective and cost-efficient than traditional protected area approaches. Development aid was being redirected towards similar integrated conservation and development initiatives. The health benefits for local communities had been an unexpected positive outcome. Improved water quality and increased availability of traditional medicinal plants were reducing disease rates. Better nutrition from sustainable fishing and improved agriculture was benefiting children's development. Mental health improvements were being documented as communities regained connection with their natural environment. Technology innovations developed for managing the corridor were being applied to conservation projects worldwide. Automated monitoring systems, mobile data collection applications, and satellite-based tracking methods were being adapted for use in other regions. The project was generating intellectual property and technological exports that contributed to Burkina Faso's economy. Cultural revitalization was occurring alongside ecological restoration. Traditional ceremonies, songs, and stories related to wildlife and natural resource management were being practiced again after years of decline. Young people were learning from elders about their cultural heritage while also gaining modern education and employment opportunities. The artificial river had become a symbol of African innovation and environmental leadership. Continental organizations were promoting the project as evidence of Africa's capacity for developing creative solutions to global challenges. International partnerships were shifting from aid relationships to collaborative arrangements based on mutual learning and benefit. As Traoré reflected on the year's achievements, he was already planning the next phase of development. Expansion into neighboring regions was being designed based on lessons learned from the initial corridor. New partnerships with universities, governments, and international organizations were being established to support long-term sustainability and continued innovation. The young leader understood that the project's greatest contribution might be its demonstration that ambitious environmental restoration was possible when communities, governments, and international partners worked together with shared vision and mutual respect. The millions of animals thriving in their restored habitat were proof that human creativity and determination could reverse even severe environmental degradation while creating prosperity and hope for future generations. 2 years after the beginning of the artificial river project, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a gathering of world leaders at the first international conference on large-scale ecosystem restoration, held along the banks of what had become known globally as the River of Life. The transformed landscape around him bore little resemblance to the arid construction site where the ambitious project had begun. The ecosystem had reached a level of maturity and stability that exceeded all scientific projections. The millions of animals that had been released into the corridor had not only survived, but had created a thriving, self-sustaining environment that was supporting even more wildlife than originally planned. Natural reproduction rates were so high that the corridor was becoming a source population that was recolonizing degraded habitats throughout West Africa. Dr. Kone had been awarded international recognition for her groundbreaking research, but she remained focused on documenting the continuing evolution of the restored ecosystem. Her latest findings showed that the artificial river was developing characteristics that mimicked natural systems while maintaining the enhanced reliability that engineering had provided. The project was proving that human intervention could successfully jumpstart natural processes rather than replace them. The economic success had transformed not just individual communities, but the entire region's development trajectory. Rural areas that had been losing population to urban migration were now attracting young families who saw opportunities for prosperity while maintaining connections to their cultural heritage. The sustainable tourism industry was generating revenue that supported continued environmental protection while providing employment for thousands of people. Local communities had become international experts in community-based conservation and ecotourism development. Delegations from other countries were coming to learn from their experiences. Community leaders were being invited to advise on conservation projects around the world. The knowledge and skills developed along the river corridor were becoming export products that contributed to the national economy. The project's influence on conservation policy had been profound. International organizations had revised their approaches to emphasize landscape-scale restoration and community participation. Funding priorities had shifted toward integrated projects that addressed both environmental and social challenges. The artificial river had become a template for sustainable development that was being adapted to different ecological and cultural contexts worldwide. Universities from 6 continents had established research partnerships focused on different aspects of the restored ecosystem. The river corridor was generating scientific discoveries that were advancing understanding of ecology, animal behavior, conservation biology, and sustainable development. Students and researchers from around the world were contributing to a growing body of knowledge while learning from local community expertise. The climate benefits had become measurable at a continental scale. The restored vegetation was sequestering significant amounts of carbon while moderating regional temperature and precipitation patterns. Other countries were implementing similar projects as part of their climate change mitigation strategies. The artificial river was demonstrating that ecosystem restoration could be a powerful tool for addressing global environmental challenges. Wildlife populations had not only recovered, but were showing levels of genetic diversity and behavioral complexity that indicated the ecosystem was functioning, as well as historical natural systems. Species that had been on the brink of extinction in the region were now thriving. New species were colonizing the corridor naturally, drawn by the abundant resources and suitable habitat conditions. The success had created opportunities for regional cooperation that were transforming international relationships in West Africa. Cross-border conservation agreements were connecting protected areas across multiple countries. Trade partnerships were developing around sustainable products from restored ecosystems. Diplomatic relationships were being strengthened through shared environmental achievements. Cultural revitalization had been one of the most meaningful outcomes for local communities. Traditional knowledge systems that had been marginalized by modern development were now recognized as essential for successful conservation. Indigenous languages were being preserved and taught alongside scientific concepts. Cultural festivals celebrating the relationship between people and wildlife were attracting international visitors while strengthening community identity. The technological innovations developed for managing the project had created new industries and export opportunities. Environmental monitoring systems, sustainable agriculture techniques, and ecotourism management approaches were being exported to other countries. Burkina Faso was becoming known as a center of innovation in conservation technology and community-based environmental management. International partnerships had evolved from aid relationships to collaborative arrangements based on mutual learning and shared benefits. Universities, governments, and organizations from around the world were working with local communities and institutions as equal partners. The project had demonstrated that developing countries could lead global efforts to address environmental challenges. As Traoré concluded his address to the international conference, he reflected on how the project had revealed the true reason behind his decision to release millions of animals into the artificial river. It had never been simply about wildlife conservation or economic development or even environmental restoration. The real purpose had been to demonstrate that human beings could choose to be partners with nature rather than its conquerors. The river corridor had become proof that prosperity and environmental health were not competing goals, but mutually reinforcing aspects of sustainable development. The millions of animals thriving in their restored habitat represented hope that the relationship between human civilization and the natural world could be transformed from one of destruction to one of collaboration and mutual benefit. Standing beside the flowing waters that had become a symbol of renewal and possibility, Traoré knew that the project's greatest success was not what it had achieved, but what it had inspired others to attempt. Around the world, similar initiatives were being planned and implemented. The artificial river had become the beginning of a global movement toward restoration, reconciliation, and hope for a future where both human communities and wildlife could flourish together. The young leader understood that history would judge his generation by their response to environmental crisis and social inequality. The river of life flowing beside him represented his generation's answer. That human creativity, determination, and cooperation could overcome even the greatest challenges when guided by vision, supported by knowledge, and grounded in respect for both people and the natural world that sustained all life on Earth.